everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at San Francisco Doc Fest. My name is Celeste Wong. I am one of the features programmers on the team. Really excited, delighted to be here today in conversation with the director of the fair, Inez Summer. Inez, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so happy to talk with people about this film.
And we're so happy to have it. It's such a remarkable film. I remember when I first watched it, I was so captivated and I didn't even necessarily know why. I was just like so drawn in, especially as someone who's I feel a little bit outside of that culture. But I was just so fascinated by it. Can you kind of start from the beginning? Tell us how you decided to capture this county fair and this specific area of Illinois on camera.
For sure. So, when my kids were little and they're grown-ups now, we would go to county fairs when we would do summer road trips, and it was always such a blast, like the kind of noisiness of it. There are the demo derbies, there's all kinds of stuff going on, and especially for little boys, that was super fascinating. I always loved the livestock competitions and like when like the cooking competitions, all of that kind of stuff. So in the back of my mind, I always knew this is would be something fun to revisit, right? So I was working on a number of years ago, I was working on a different film and I really needed a pause from it. And I thought, oh, okay, maybe this is the time. So I reached out to a number of county fairs that were happening during, those summer months. And the folks from the Menard County Fair said, yes, okay, you can come and film. So that, was basically it, right? There were a number of other fairs during the same time period, but they didn't answer their emails. And they allowed me to film behind the scenes, which was kind of crucial so that you can go behind the barricades and just see how people and animals interact, how the young women kind of prepare themselves for the beauty contests and so on. So they really didn't put any restrictions on me, which was wonderful. I think they were probably hoping it would turn more into like a marketing kind of tool, but that's not what this film is, actually. So I some of my practice is working solo. I often work collaboratively too, but in this case, working solo made the most sense. I think your screen is frozen. I don't know. Are we okay in terms of the internet?
I can hear you. Your
Celeste,
image is a little static,
can
but
you
I
hear
can
me?
hear
Okay, yeah. Yeah. Just internet sometimes is a little spotty. So um anyway, so I spent 3.5 days. I didn't even, I didn't have the time to spend like the full 10 days that the fair goes on. So it was very, I picked it so that we would get the opening ceremony when they're cutting the ribbon and a little bit of a prep day. So it's limited in that sense, and also it's limited and in a good way by just me being present and not having a crew, because I think that would call attention to itself a lot more rather than there's just a middle-aged lady with her little DSLR. And I think that really lowers the guard for people so they don't feel like they need to perform for the camera, right? And I think that's really important in terms of doing this kind of observational work, is that you're allowed in and that you become part of the furniture, right? You're not necessarily calling attention to yourself the whole time. And people were super welcoming, so I was really grateful.
Oh, good. Yeah, I wanted to ask a little bit more about that. The observational approaches, of course, yeah, really comes through in the final product, and it's remarkable how, yeah, it seems like people are just behaving so naturally. Um, but I imagine in some cases that's a little hard to get. Like, did you feel like sometimes you had to kind of like gain people's trust or just make people feel more at ease? Did you encounter any like sort of resistance to people wanting to be like captured in that way?
So I think you can see it in the film. There are a couple moments where people might glance at the camera and be kind of puzzled. I think that's the most in terms of like, not being entirely comfortable. So, like the folks who are like weighing the pigs, right? Like they were looking at me quizzically, like, what is this woman doing there? Like filming us doing this. So, but they still allowed me to be there, right? And I think that has to do with not being overly aggressive in terms of like intruding onto a scene. Or I can't even recall. I might have said something like, it's okay, I got permission to film or something along those lines. So there was nobody ever questioning me. And then at times it's just enough to also either make eye contact or talk with people briefly. Hey, I'm here. I'm doing this behind the scenes documentary on the fair. Um, and hope you're okay with this. So just this kind of simple contact is often enough that people feel good about you being there. And then especially with the folks who are running the beauty pageant, with them it was really, being present for those 3 days and just hanging out, and they were really lovely.
Yeah, I think one thing that really nicely comes through is in the observational approach is a very sort of non-judgmental lens. And for me, coming from a culture outside of that, I think people can often like put quite of a veil of of judgment or just sort of not understanding. But and I think your film speaks to, a larger cultural trends and, our current moment, but in a way that still feels respectful of the people you were there with. Can you talk about maybe a little bit like creating that tone?
Yeah, so I think, on the one hand, you want to approach you being present in the filming with empathy and not with too much of an agenda, right? So if my agenda is to show this is a super conservative community, I could have showed more vendors with MAGA t-shirts. There's like one shot of that, or, I could have sought out the kind of undercurrents that I could sense. But I think in the capturing, it's important to be less judgmental and to just see, right? To just watch. And I think some of the themes that I noticed came out more afterwards in the editing, right? Like the how the animals are being measured and weighed, and how the women also are getting, like they have to fit a certain template. So how rules are being established, even around like how garments are judged and so on. I mean, it's across the board. So that was kind of a theme that in editing kind of came out. Um, it's a like very white community. It's very homogenous to a certain degree. And so as somebody who lives in Chicago, which is a super diverse city, especially my neighborhood is very diverse, I noticed that and I captured some moments where you where are people of color present, right? As performers. So that also comes out in the editing because I included both the harness racing and the wrestling match. You can see the tail end. I only caught the tail end of like when black performers were wrestling. So, by including that in the mix, in the editing, I don't need to be too heavy-handed about this. It's just like if you include it in the mix, if it's a viewer who pays attention will kind of see that, right? That what the kind of minimal presence of those bodies means, right? So I think if there's criticality in the film, it's through the editing juxtapositions, I'd say.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the editing. That's really interesting, that it came out in that way. Um, yeah, were you I guess I'd love to hear a little bit more about that process. Like, were you sort of surprised? Did that angle um of like juxtaposing of course, the livestock competitions with the pageant? Um, Yeah, was that something that you like work with other collaborators on? Yeah, just like what was that process of, because I imagine you had a lot of footage even though you weren't there for that long. What is like the actual kind of like process of finding that story?
Yeah. So, there was a certain chronology to this, clearly, like the prep day, the day that fair opens, and then I kind of condensed the last 1.5 days into one day so that you have kind of a pre-made story arc in that sense, right? And that is really helpful. I did the editing and then got feedback from friends or, colleagues. I think I didn't have all that much footage, to be honest. And maybe that comes from my original training in film versus video, right? Where you're like really frugal about how much you shoot. And I still have that. So this is just, like a limited amount of footage that this is how it has to work. There is no going back. I can't just go back and film another county fair and insert those shots. So it's kind of a nice restriction, right? To work with just this is these are the ingredients I have. Let's cook with this. Um, some of the themes were clear to me as I was filming, right? But then they became heightened as I was editing. I think the juxtaposition of the animal competitions and the beauty pageant, I didn't want it to be too heavy-handed, so it doesn't typically like intercut it in a way where you're like, oh yeah, this is the same, but it's more that it infuses the entire film. And I think that's part of what hopefully will make it more interesting for an audience member too, that they're asked to kind of piece some of this together rather than being too heavy-handed and saying, look, this is the same.
Yeah,
Because I always look for a more engaged viewer, right?
exactly. Yeah, I think it goes to what you were saying before. It really inspires us to just ask questions of like why is this so gendered in this way? Why is this so segregated racially in this way? So yeah, it's really compelling, and it's compelling that there's so many kids involved too, like how young these sort of practices begin. Um, and I think you captured that and edited that together in such a smart way. I'm curious about your work at large in terms of it seems like there's an interest in like rural, perhaps mostly Midwestern areas and cultures. Um, and I think in this film too, it really speaks to like larger phenomenons that we see everywhere, even in cities, even in, outside of those areas. Um, so I'm curious, do you find that like those types of places really help us sort of understand where the country is at large, or is there like another specific interest that you have?
It's a combination. I've made a lot of films that were based in Chicago because I like working regionally where I don't have to like fly in somewhere and, have limited amounts of days spending with participants. So there is something about doing something locally. And, this is like, I think this fair was like 3.5, 4 hours away from me. So not like super locally, right? But regional enough, right? That I could easily travel there by myself and spend some time. Um, I've when I look at my practice overall, there are like a bunch of different strands, so I've made essay films, I've made more like variety films that have interview material integrated. I'm considering this an ethnographic film, which I've never done before. So each film presents another interesting challenge for me as a filmmaker, which is fun. So it's less kind of commercially driven or like where will this land necessarily, but more like how can I keep myself engaged in this kind of journey of discovery, right? So I'd love to do more work along those lines, but I'm kind of agnostic in terms of style, and I've made a lot of experimental work too. So it's all, each project will find its own form. I tend to always be behind the camera. Sometimes I can afford to hire an editor. Sometimes I do it myself. That's also based on each project. Um, I'd love to do more rural stories. I think that's something that's not, there are not as many films about rural America as there are about other topics. I think it's an area that deserves to be looked at more. I think sometimes those films have a more maybe romanticized view of rural America, or it's like, oh, the meth crisis and so on. So I think my strategy is more like, are there stories that we're not so used to looking at in this context? I think when I mentioned to other folks that I made this film on a county fair, for them it immediately kicks in kind of nostalgia and something more entertaining. And that didn't really happen to me because I didn't grow up in the US. So I'm ultimately, even if I can relate, I'm always going to be another, right? I'm always going to be the outsider. And I think that's also why it kind of works for me to frame it as an ethnographic film because I'm the ethnographer looking at American culture, right? Which is maybe not so common. We're not looking at exotic cultures unless the US is considered exotic, maybe from my point of view. I don't know.
Yeah, I love that framing of it. And I think that really comes through too. I'm curious, just finally, you did mention that maybe the county fair may have expected it to be a little bit more like something that they could use for marketing or promotional purposes for their fair. Has there been like conversations with them? Have they seen the film? Was that something that you felt like you um I don't know, had to kind of like address with them?
So I think it just came through in a subtle way because, it's a small county fair. I think they're hoping that it would attract more visitors, which I'm not sure if it will, right? So the film, this is only its second screening. So I haven't really reached out to them yet, but I would be happy to share it with them during the next fair or, if they want me to make a 5-minute short that they can use. I'm going to offer that to them, but I'm just not sure if this is exactly what they thought, how they're coming across, right? And it's not that it's a negative view. It's more a little bit less less leaning into marketing language, I'd say, than maybe somebody would expect. So something to be explored with them. Like, is this useful to them? Because I think overall, their experience with me and my experience with them was really positive. So I don't think there should be an issue or that they need to be ashamed of what they're doing. It's
Yeah.
um in some way, I've found it almost like the fair is, it's such a community event. So many people are volunteers, so there is something also really commendable about, folks doing this once a year. So it's a big engine for their community. And I think I hope that comes across through the film too. So I'm not looking at this as, oh, let's judge these people, but it's a portrait of that community that has nuance, right?
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I think you see that a lot with the behind the scenes of the pageant stuff and the former pageant contestants like mentoring the younger ones and with so much care and a lot of love, you can see that come through. And those intergenerational relationships are something that like any community, I think, can see themselves in at least a little bit.
Yeah,
Um,
and I appreciate some of the humor. I mean, it's
yeah.
kind of a lot of like strange little like humorous exchanges that I included because I enjoyed them, right? So I think it's is it possible for us as filmmakers, but also as audience members, to look at this and to kind of understand maybe the undercurrents and pitfalls, but
Mhm.
still not, condemn people, right?
Mhm.
I think that's kind of important to me. um, because they're not political figureheads, right? They're not, even if they might make politically difficult or bad choices, right? And I'm assuming that because it's a very, very conservative corner of the state, I can still appreciate what they're trying to do for their community. And maybe that's a way to reach people too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a beautiful note to end on. Thank you so much for sharing all that insight and for sharing your film, The Fair, with our audiences. Um, yeah, and thank you all at home for watching. All
Thank
right.
you for having me, Celeste. Great to meet you. And thanks to everybody for watching. All right.